I'm going to go ahead and call us to order and declare that we have a quorum present of 7 members. Item C1, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to the 2018-19 budget development. Dr. Ely.
Mr. President, members of the board, we have a first real comprehensive look at the 2018-19 budget. I'll remind everyone that this is April and we have until August to finalize the entire budget, so this will be a work in progress. We plan to bring back to the board both in May and in June and July as we continue to work through the various parameters that are before us in creating a budget. So here with the presentation of where we are today is Mike Martindale, Deputy Superintendent and Chief Financial Officer. Have I vamped long enough? Mr. Martindale.
Sorry, Dr. Ely, I'm having technical difficulties. Okay.
I'd just like to say this is my favorite presentation all year. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm speechless now. I don't even know what to say. The August one is my favorite, Dr. Westman. With that being said, there's not a whole lot of change between March and April as far as budget development goes. We're slated to get our preliminary appraisal values the end of this month. So hopefully there'll be some movement as far as our projections in May. So since you set the table, I go ahead and let you down easy right in the beginning here. Before we move to 18-19, let's just take a look at how we're tracking currently. Current, and this is through the end of the 5th 6 weeks, our average daily attendance is tracking at 2.97%. So that's a significant driver as far as our revenue. We budgeted for 2.9% when we adopted the budget last year. So we're tracking a little bit ahead from that standpoint. These are our current revenue values that we have in our budget as of to date. We have, through the course of this year, amended a few of these up. For example, the interest earned, and Dr. Weston, just for you, we have, because interest rates are just going through the roof now, we've been able to generate some additional revenue from that standpoint. So we've amended that value up from our originally adopted budget. Our co-curricular, just a hair. The big one is SHARS, and that's due to the work of Ms. Parks, the business office, and Ms. Perry. That is the Medicaid reimbursement for services kiddos receive from our personnel. We originally budgeted that at $500,000, but they have really begun the process of submitting those reimbursements, and so that's become a revenue of note for us through the course of this year. And also you'll notice that as I project that out to the future. Our foundation, our state foundation available values remain consistent through the course of the year. That fluctuates just a little bit back and forth depending on how our ADA tracks from 6 weeks to 6 weeks. So projecting a little over $113 million on the revenue side for this year. On the appropriations side, we're currently at $87.2 million for payroll. We adopted less than that, but through the course of the fall, because we were tracking better on our revenue side, we've approved a handful of positions through the course of the fall. So that's added a little bit to that particular number. Contracted services, that's up a little bit for some one-time expenses through the course of this year as opposed to what we adopted in August, as well as the $6,300 in materials and supplies. We adopted less than that. This has been us able to capture some of the cost with, for example, the band uniforms, middle school uniforms. I also went ahead and captured a patrol car for Welborn Middle School SRD since we had capacity. So when we look at next year, you'll see this number actually go down because I'm backing those one-time costs out of this. But since we had capacity, we'll go ahead and try to grab some of those things because we don't necessarily have that capacity in our early projections for next year. Other numbers remaining consistent. Total appropriations at $114.6. Obviously, that would track us at about a $1.4 million deficit. We adopted a 2.4. We put a little bit of since we're tracking stronger, I just denoted a little 650,000 for as cabinet begins to review the exceptional items that requested for next year. I tried to just earmark a little bit of money to allow us the opportunity to maybe get some of those things in current year budget again, since we have a little bit of capacity and we're tracking well within our adopted of this year at 2.4. So we are tracking in a positive manner with respect to what we adopted last August for current year. Recapture, sorry, I missed the funnest one of all. 4.8, that'll probably settle out at 5 once we get through the 6 weeks or the end of the school year. That moves also kind of throughout the course of the year, depending on ADA and a number of other things. We adopted 5.9 on this number. The difference is we're tracking a little bit better, not that much than what we projected on our average daily attendance. Where we've really made up a difference on this, and you've heard Ms. Perry mention this as well as me a couple of times, is this calculation is based on a weighted average daily attendance. So there are some weights depending on the kids and their attendance. They're weighted differently. It's not just a 1.0 weight, but there's some additional weight depending on services the child may receive. So those weights or that increased enrollment, especially in our special programs that we're managing with staffing requests for next year and those types of things, those weights are what generating the difference in what we originally projected with our recapture, which is trending, a positive way for us. So that's where we're recognizing some difference in our projected budget as well as a lower appropriations. So that's current year. Start looking at 18-19. You're familiar with these timelines. We touched base on these last month. Of course, our initial runs try to go ahead and notify principals and directors of new personnel requests for next year, as well as some exceptional item requests. The date we have set on that's the 27th. They're all well aware of the fact that we're managing some things as far as projected enrollment and implications with charter and those types of things. So we'll try to notify the folks of the things that cabinet has approved at that point in time on that particular Friday. I probably need to look at the timing of this because then the following week we get our preliminary values from BCAD. So that is when we'll be able to really start getting a feel for what property values are going to look like for next year. And as of course you're all aware of the fact that our revenue is really primarily driven by our local collections and local values. We'll come back hopefully with much more updated numbers than what we're looking at now because of the appraisal district preliminary numbers in May. Typically bring compensation packages for the next school year in June. We didn't last year because it is a legislative year, but we should be on mark for that this year. An update at the July board meeting. We received final values end of July. And of course, you're all aware that in August, we look to set our tax rate with the proposed budget that we have in hand. Again, just to follow up from last month, right now, Cabinet's considering request of $5.2 million in new personnel. It was 4.5 when we spoke last month. I had a few late submissions since then. Exceptional items, again, tracking at 1.9. And this is that exceptional item. If you remember, I was looking at current year 17-18, where I was trying to earmark a little bit of money. I'm trying to take a little bit of a chunk out of that current year since our numbers are a little tighter looking forward. For 18-19, the revenue side, leaving it 0.3 at this point in time, begin to attempt to have some communication with the charter and their enrollment here in the next week or two to try to track down exactly what this is going to look like over the next several months. The local values, one adjustment I did make since last month, I had that at 7%. I just tweaked it up to 7.2 because that's what we've been running as far as the last 6 years. And never mind, I was going to say something. Sorry. Appropriations. The blue, I'm sorry, the blue is where I made an adjustment since March. I felt comfortable with making that adjustment at this point in time.
People's comments in the community seem to be that we might be going up more than 7.2%. But
I was,
of course, we're not hearing from people who are happy with their increase. We're only hearing from people who are not happy. So,
yes, sir, based on looking at my own numbers, I felt comfortable with that adjustment. On the appropriation side, staying consistent with the 1.3 million for salary adjustments. Haven't made any adjustments as far as health insurance or supplies and materials collectively across the district. New staff request exceptional items. I had it tracking at 500 in March, up that to 750 again because they're recognizing a couple of shifts as far as the revenue side as well as this recapture number. Wellborn is still running at 2.4 million. If you remember last year, Contrail is 1.8. Excuse me, 1.4. And what I was about to say is, opening new buildings is wonderful, but if you look, there's $3.8 million of opening new buildings the last 2 years on top of everything else we're managing. So recapture, clean some of those numbers up was not quite as conservative on some of my weights as previously after we got through the 5th 6 weeks. I do think for the year, this current year will end at 5 million. I was running about 14.6 in that in March, so I think clean that up a little bit based on some weights and projections. So recognizing some of that difference, there's a little bit of movement in the numbers from last month, not a whole lot.
They don't have an exceeding number at all?
And exceeding.
Like that they would not to exceed.
Oh, recapture? Unfortunately not, no. Because, well, I'll speak to it in just a minute, Ms. Barrett. Obviously, that number will move on us throughout the course of time based on where our ADA number eventually settles in. So just know the recapture number, there's going to be movement as we try to get a hold on what our ADA projection is, okay? So the 0.3, as I mentioned to you on ADA, 7.2% on property values. Kept all the current revenue projections consistent with where they are now, the amended amounts that we're utilizing now all the way through. Our state revenue projections brings us in at 123.5 on the revenue side. Our payroll is 6,100. I have it 89.4. There's a couple of things in there that has the 1.3 million for salary adjustments. I put the 750,000 for new personnel exceptional items in there. Also, there's a little bit of difference beyond that because approved some positions at midterm, so I count for part of their salary in 17, 18, and a little bit more picking up the second half of their salary the next year. Wellborn, here's the Wellborn at 2.4. TRS contracted services. This is backing a little bit of one-time cost out of this. This change is utilities at Wellborn Middle School. It's really $200,000 after I back out from previous year. Here's your recapture number. And that's the perfect storm on this is we're coming off of current year, we're 11%, over 11% growth on values this past year. This number is built on previous year property values. So you're looking at a significant increase in property values last year combined with very little growth in ADA projections. So we've kind of lined up the perfect storm here, so to speak, if you say. So 14.2, 5.3 for 6,300s, and this is where captures some of these one-time costs, and I just backed those out. So that's real close to what we adopted in August when I minus out one-time expenses that we've captured this year. The other numbers are consistent. 128. This was a 4.9 last month, so 4.7 currently. A couple of things of note that for every percentage our property values change, it has a net effect of about $900,000. So just future forecasting to think about.
How much of that increases the recapture payment?
Will net 900. The recapture, I don't remember, it does adjust the recapture to some degree, but we recognize a difference of 900.
Okay.
Is what I did, Jeff, when I ran it, was I was looking for the difference and it had on the projected deficit.
Well, I think, you know, the good thing to note is all that extra money that we're just going to pay out to the state. The good thing is they're reducing school funding by about 1.5 times the amount that increases are going up. So that's a positive, yeah. It's funny how they find a way to work that out.
I think that's sarcasm.
What? Sarcasm? Not me. But I think it's worth noting. It's in the budget at the state level. It's not like we haven't beat this horse quite a bit, but we might as well keep beating it. That they have planned for these property tax increases. They know how much extra money they're going to collect at the state level, and then they are reducing their portion of funding to schools on the basis of that. And they're shifting the burden onto everybody who pays property taxes, and at the same time, out of the other side of their mouth, complaining about how local property taxes are going up. Very inconsistent, hypocritical, in my opinion. But anyways, it's just an opinion.
It goes without saying, a very different picture if we're not managing recapture. Very different picture, very circumstances for us. So, all right, this is the run out 5-year projection. We've looked at 17, 18, and 18, 19. So this is what we use to try to look at our cash flow versus our projected fund balance numbers. So looking at years, the ADA growth is the one I want to highlight. This is from Templeton's projections in the out years. It was pretty conservative on our property values, maybe. I don't know, relative to recent times. So it's difficult to really say what exactly they will look like in the future. So projected numbers across as far as potential deficits. I think something to make note of on this is good to look at just as a gauge, and we'll look at the graph here momentarily. But I do want the board to realize that we're looking at between 2019 and 2020 and 2020, 21. We're looking at, 2018 and 20, we're looking at a legislative year here and a legislative out year here. So this is under current school finance system. So understand we could be sitting here this time next year, and whatever adjustments are made to the funding system will change every bit of these out years. So I think we just have to make sure and be cognizant and keep that in the frame, so to speak. So understand you're looking at 2021, 2022. There are 2 legislative sessions between now and then. So know that it could very much not look like this. Positive or negative, I don't know, but just know that it could be very.
They've been telling us that for quite a number of years. So,
like,
I mean,
I've been sitting here a long time, and you have too. I haven't seen it in the positive for the district yet.
If they are tempted to address the equalized wealth level, which sets the recapture rate, that would benefit us tremendously. I really, honestly don't need them to do anything else. If they manage that to some degree, then it has an influence on what we're paying at recapture. And that will affect us in a positive way simply because we're not having to account for that appropriation. Does that make sense? So I want to say that as disclaimer because every bit of this can change this time next year. But it helps us as a good gauge. So these numbers are utilized for us to look at our graph which we're going to take a look at our cash flow percentage versus our projected appropriations and fund balance number.
$21 million on that list.
Right here.
54 in 3 years.
So the yellow is kind of just our take notice line, nothing that we're to panic over, but it's just our marker. And what that is 17 and a half, it's cash flow line, 17.5% of the projected appropriations for that corresponding year in the out years, okay? The red is the fund balance projections when we adopted our budget last August. Okay, so here's current year. You see those lines cross up between 2019, 2020 year. This is when your fund balance goes below that 17.5% cash flow number projected for the appropriations for that year. Okay. We had audit. We put a little bit of money in the bank, which again is serving us well in this scenario. So it moved our green line up. It actually, when these cross out, if you notice, it added a year out on that when it hits that cash flow number versus where it was last August. The green is our current projection. Okay, and you can see, for example, I think I said this last year also, is it's a positive to open new schools, but it requires resources. And so you can kind of see that playing out in our budget a little bit. Here's, Welborn opening elementary or River Bend opening, and then you get a little flattening out of it in the out years. So there are our early projections. Look for, again, preliminary values from BCAD in a few weeks. So that will have an influence on some of these numbers too when we come back and visit in May. Okay.
I do think it's worth noting because I think people listen and I know that they're watching at this time. But the thing that occurs to me is that we're going to give $14 million back to the state of our operating budget, a little over is what you're projecting. People ask us why we can't just build a school. There it is right there. We have to have some way to operate it. You can vote to fund the building of it. But if we can't operate it, then it does us no good to have an empty building because we can't operate it. And if people don't start getting upset about that, we're sending back $14 million and putting us in the deficit that we see, then, we are going to find ourselves in a whole lot of hurt. All districts are, not just this district, but somebody's got to start listening to us. Our legislators have got to listen to us about we are not mismanaging funds. We're trying to educate these children, and they are taking more and more of our funds away, and it's creating a real deficit with learning, in my opinion, in the future to come if we don't start. We're holding on here, and we've done a great job. You all have done a great job of managing funds. I know sometimes people don't think that, but we are not in a hurt, so like some of these other districts are that I know are painfully not in the same position that we've been put in from some great planning over the years by the district. And I just want to commend you on us not being here and sitting here and thinking how are we going to teach them tomorrow. So I appreciate you, and I'm just sorry that we're again looking at this, and for however many years I've sat on the board, 9 years now, I continue to shake my head. I don't know what else to say, but to say it's got to be a ground from the ground up saying stop the insanity.
So I appreciate your comments on that, Mrs. Barrett and Dr. Weston, about that. I think would be remiss if we didn't note that the Texas House last legislative session, both in the regular session and the special session, did pass meaningful school finance reform that would have helped out College Station ISD and other school districts across the state. But their efforts to get that passed, the other house, were thwarted, and so it did not come to pass in either the regular session or the special session. I do appreciate our local House members that represent College Station ISD. They understand this, but I think you're both right. We need more help from Austin and we need more help from the Senate to understand the plight that Texas public schools find themselves in. And hopefully we will be able to get that in the 2019 session.
And I think that people also need to understand that $14 million doesn't go to other children to be educated. It goes back into the general fund of Texas. Is that not correct?
What it allows, it goes back to the state, which does go to fund the state's portion of those local tax dollars. It goes and funds the state's portion of educating children. But what it allows the state to do is not use that money, which they would have normally used for public education, for other things. It is literally a revenue item in the state's general budget. So,
In other words, they're using local property taxes and the increase in those taxes to balance their budget, while at the same time cutting funding to schools. And most people believe that all of that money comes in, and all they essentially do is watch that pool of property taxes go up and then turn around and lower funding on the other side. And, you know, they've been doing this for a while now, and I'm stunned that people haven't found a way to call them out on it yet. And I got to comment. I'm not.
And Carol, and I'll close on this, is we are very fortunate due to the work of those before us and some wise decision-making and planning, because, yeah, I mean, it's obviously difficult to swallow, but we're in much better position than many of our counterparts. And that's due to the wise work of those previously. So, so I think that's important to note. Yes, it's difficult for us. There are many in more difficult situations. So again, fortunate for the work for those previous. I assure you, they positioned us to manage this as best as possible.
So the districts that do not have the fund balances, like we're fortunate to have, sooner or later, they're going to start, going bankrupt or just completely cutting services, or?
they would have to cut services. I mean, if you look at College Station ISD and some of the things that we are able to provide, we have music and we have computer and we have all that and art at the elementary school level, and many districts in the state don't have that. We have an orchestra program. Many don't have that. Ours starts in 5th grade. And so some of these districts have had to forego those or cut those types of discretionary programs over the years, as it's gotten harder and harder and tighter on them school funding wise. So we're blessed to be able to be as Mr. Martindale said, in a better position than many districts. Some are giving back 40 million more than that. Some are almost giving back as much as they're keeping. You know, there's 1,030 public school districts in the state of Texas, not counting charter schools. And we've got about 200 or so that are revenue contributing. That's what we are. We contribute revenue to the state. So there's still a lot that aren't. They're still getting primary amount of their money from the state. But for those districts that are sending local tax dollars back to the state, there's a pretty sizable sum. I think it's about over $2 billion in the next budget that's coming to the state from local school property taxes. And we contribute, as you see, $5 million one year, about $14 million the next, so $19 million over the biennium.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Any other questions?
That was very uplifting.
Yeah. Appreciate, especially the way you summed up there at the end. That's great.
Now I know why you have that tie on today.
I do like that. I do like that interest adjustment, though. I appreciate that. Thanks for throwing
Thank you,
that
Mr. Martindale.
Okay, item C2, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to student drug testing. Dr. Ely.
Mr. President, members of the board, we began a discussion regarding the about the district's consideration of potentially having a random student drug testing program for students, secondary students who participate in extracurricular activities. We had an initial discussion at our March meeting. We're coming back here in April to continue the discussion. We know this will take a few meetings to iron out and determine if this is the direction that we want to go with this. So Greg McIntyre, Chief Administrative Officer, will kind of talk us through some of the more updated information we have and talk us through some of the decision points that we'll have with us coming up here in the future. So with that, Mr. McIntyre.
Dr. Wesson, I realize that Mr. Martindale's was your favorite of the evening. You made that quite clear, so hopefully we'll be able to be a second favorite, maybe. Okay. Okay. What I thought we might do this evening is take a look and review just a little bit for a few slides about what we talked about almost a month ago with random student drug testing. You might remember that we started off with why. Why would we take a look at or even consider random student drug testing? And we really outlined 4 reasons. 1, for health and safety. Another, to serve as a deterrent. Third, to present a credible means for kids to resist peer pressure. And then also to be able to provide a source of information to parents. We also took a look at who could be tested. And so we outlined a little bit so far as, well, what grade levels? Well, possibly 7 through 12. It could also be 9 through 12. Extracurricular activities or students at the high school level who might have a parking sticker with parking privileges at the campus. We also talked a little bit about how parents could voluntarily ask for their kiddos to be included in the random student drug testing if their child did not fall into one of those groups that we talked about earlier. We also took a look at what could be tested. A drug testing lab could test a variety of substances from alcohol to steroids. We talked a little bit about a 5-panel drug test as well as other substances as well. And we also mentioned and talked about how the test results would be confidential, that student privacy would be protected, that it would only be shared with parents or guardians, and then of course a designated administrator on that campus. And then also a timeline. It's possible that if we choose to go this direction, that it could begin with the 2018-19 school year and have 3 major components. One is students registering for parking stickers or extracurricular activities or their parents opting them in. Also having an orientation, and then thirdly, the consent form that parents would sign on their child's behalf. And this evening, we thought we would take a look at 4 main areas. One is pricing. There have been some questions about what does this cost. Also, the list of substances, possible consequences, and this evening, not making any decisions tonight, but to leave with outlining some decision points that we need to think about before we come back in May and continue our conversation. So far as pricing is concerned, we can access random student drug testing through the Harris County Department of Education co-op. And these are the 2017 prices that they have. As a matter of fact, they're meeting tomorrow, so we won't know the 2018 till a little bit later in the week or possibly the beginning of next week whenever they publish their decisions and select a vendor and those kinds of things. But this, I think, gives us a pretty good idea. It's about $20 for what is called a 9-panel drug test, also including alcohol. And we'll take a look at what those drugs are in just a second. So far as other options that could be considered, bath salts is about a $40 test. K2, which is also synthetic marijuana, is an additional $8. You can see about $50 per test to retest certain ones like synthetic marijuana, or $150 to retest an original sample. And then also about $100 to test for steroids. That's a lot of numbers. So let's just take a look at the substances, and then also we'll take a look at how many students we might be talking about and those kinds of things. The standard 9-panel drug test went ahead and listed out what those drugs are, and then also in parentheses I put a few descriptors that maybe some people have heard of, because I'll be honest with you, I am not an expert in pronouncing all of these substances. And so you can see it starts off with marijuana and cocaine and ends up with methadone and Darvon and some of the others. So that's what's referred to as a 9-panel drug test, and that was the $20 that was referred to a little bit earlier, so far as the Harris County Department of Ed co-op. So far as taking a look at estimated costs and just making a few assumptions here, if we had the 9-panel drug test, including alcohol, that would be about $20. If we also included synthetic marijuana, that'd be an additional $8. And then so far as the retesting, and I'll talk a little bit about retesting and also the initial test and what that includes in just a second to hopefully bring some clarity to that. And combining that with a number of eligible students. So at our high schools, we have about 1,100 students that park at our schools. For extracurricular activities, roughly about 3,000 students, and then we have another 1,000 students in our career tech programs that also participate in many of the extracurricular activities there. Now, realizing when you add that up, you get about 5,100, and knowing that you're going to have some overlap. Some students who drive and have a parking sticker are also involved in extracurricular, or they may also be in that career tech program. And so if we had about 4,000 students to draw from in that testing pool, if you will, then we have some decisions to make about what percentage of students on any given year would we want to test up to. I believe we talked about the up to language last time, up to 10%, 20%, 50%, whatever that percentage is, it does give us some leeway. And so in doing that math, you can see depending on the substances and the price list that we choose, let me go back just a second, and depending on how many of these we would be interested in choosing, that certainly affects the total cost whenever we do the percentage. Now, possible consequences. A first positive result, many districts take a look at a 30 school day suspension from participating in whatever that elective activity is. That elective activity being choosing to be an extracurricular activity, choosing to park on campus, those kinds of things. And then I put a note on this first slide saying that the TASB text says an initial positive test shall be confirmed by a second test of the same sample before being reported as positive. So that gives us some indication as to what the methodology looks like, that it's not simply a positive on that first portion. What they'll do is go back to that original sample, test it again to make sure that they have those two positives before they finally report a positive result to us.
Is that why that cost is so high?
Probably, yes.
Yeah, but so that $150, which I believe it was, is, I mean, if someone tests positive, it's a guaranteed, they're adding 150, or is that included, or is that, I was, when it popped up the first time, I was thinking if someone is angry and they want to appeal it, that's where that cost was incurred. But it's just, if it's positive, we're going to get incurred $150.
No, I think the way that it reads that if someone, like you said, wanted to contest the results of what's being reported to us as a positive, then it would be that 150 that cost would have to be incurred. In most districts, what they do is that they ask that the family, the parents would incur that cost if they want to contest a positive result that has already been tested twice. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's a little bit between confirming a test result for a positive report and then going back and retesting and having a second sample and going through that entire process. That charge will be $150, and typically most school districts choose for the parent to pay that.
Well, yeah, two questions related to that. One, the obvious, what if they don't have $150 to pay for the retest? Does that mean they don't get an effective appeal? And could we do something to mitigate that, or should we do something to mitigate that? And then we could hit that first, or I don't know how you want to do that if we talk about that now, or if that's on our list in our ongoing dialogue. Okay. And then the second thing was just to confirm that they test it once. If they get a positive, they retest it. It's
The
the
same
exact,
sample.
the same sample. Is
Yes.
it the exact same methodology, or is it,
From what I understand, it's the same methodology.
okay, so it's not like, well, they do a first run that's kind of loosey-goosey. If it comes back positive, then they go back and really look at it?
No.
Because that would
I
not
don't
be
think
good.
there's a loosey-goosey test the first time around. I think they're the same test.
I loved his eyes. I wish the rest
But
of
yeah, I
it
mean,
was
that,
no.
that's
Okay,
what,
and
and
the
that cost.
$150 one is also, I mean, it's just a third time of the same exact testing.
No, the student would have to come back in for an additional testing. They give an additional sample. We're talking a urine test. So
Oh,
they've already tested the first sample twice. They have no more to test. So they would have the student come in within a defined amount of time to take a second test.
Okay, so that, depending on what it's positive for, some of those things on your list, trying to think back to the health class I had, I think it was in 7th grade, stay in your blood longer than others
That is
or in
correct.
your system.
That's
So,
why they recommend at least a 30-day waiting period before a student, if they come off of suspension because of this, let's say first offense is a 30 school day suspension, they recommend that there would be at least a 30-day space in there before the student comes back in, because what you'll see here in a second is that many school districts also ask that students come back in for another test and have a negative test before they can then participate in the extracurricular activity.
okay.
That is also called retesting, so it can get a little confusing.
What's the fee structure for that retest? Is it the 150?
No, whenever the student would come back in and have to get a negative test result, that would be on the 20.
Okay.
Okay, and you probably don't have that, but this is a question I would have. If they come in for that retest and they don't test negative, is it another, I'm not asking you to answer this tonight, but would it be another 30-day, or is there?
I have not seen that in any policy to this point, to be honest with you. Right.
one of the questions I have is, and again, I'm very naive on some of these drugs, but how if it's a doctor prescribed? Do we have, or are these not doctor prescribed?
Some of them can be doctor prescribed, and if there's a positive test, many times the policy, one of the decisions we would have to make is that the student or parent will have X number of days following that positive test to have a meeting and provide medical explanation for the positive result. And then the lab has a certified person on their end who can take a look at that medical reason that was provided by a doctor and then make a determination.
Could you not, again, just the question, could you not have somebody like it be on record?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, you can. But I think I've seen it a couple of ways. One is at the very beginning, you ask a family to go ahead and provide that list of medications that a student may be on that might trigger that test. And then if there is a positive test, making sure that we have medical certification again that that student is still on that medication.
And that 9-panel test tells exactly which drug they're testing positive for?
Yes, we would list out exactly which drugs are in that 9-panel test, which is pretty extensive.
Okay, if we've determined we have a problem, does the 9-panel test cover what we think the problem is?
Agent shaking his head no.
I'll say no.
I think the 9-panel test covers a lot of what we would want to test for. And if you were asking me, I think we should also add in K2 and synthetic marijuana. So that's when you saw a couple of slides ago, we had 20 and 8 in there, kind of as just my thinking right now.
What about bath salts?
You know, that was still a thing.
I didn't either.
Still a thing? It was ever a thing?
What the hell was it? It had some, oh, sorry. That's not the right way to put it. I feel bad as a sophomore. I got a sophomore in high school. I got no idea what that is.
Synthetic.
Bath salts are. I guess so.
It's also a synthetic drug that is produced and is illegal to ingest.
Okay. And that's just what it's called. That's
Yes.
not obviously what it is.
Right.
Okay. I don't know whether I'm happy or sad. I had no idea. I do not need any salts.
From there, you can see that typically many districts will take a look at a second positive result with a 60-day suspension, school day suspension, and then third and
Not a school day suspension, suspension from those activities.
well, from those activities. Sorry, all of this is with around the activities of extracurriculars, parking passes, those kinds of things, not compulsory attendance, obviously. But 30-day from competition, performance, or parking, followed by a 60, and then followed by a 90, which is quite a long time, to be quite honest with you.
So does that 30-day mean 6 weeks? Because it's 30 school days, or is that 30
It would be about
calendar
6
days?
to 7 weeks, depending on how many holidays we might have in there.
So it could
But I think it's
easily
more
drags out there.
specific language to specify the number of days rather than the number of weeks. Because some weeks, like a Thanksgiving week, may only come to school 2 days, but we have 3 days off. Does that count? Does it not? I think it's much clearer to go ahead and specify the number of days.
Now, if you have a parent that's opted in that their child's not a part of any of this,
Then
then
it's just information for the
it's just
parent.
information.
Yes,
So the school wouldn't take any action.
correct.
It doesn't affect their grades
No.
in any of them. Yeah. Can they still practice?
Again, those will be questions that we can, that as we go deeper in this and in subsequent meetings, we could talk about. Does that mean, suspension from just competition performance and practice, or just they could practice but not be involved in the competitions?
Do we have input from our coaches, band directors, et cetera, about what they would like to see in that if they had someone come in with a positive result?
We will certainly get that from them. We know that our athletic department has gone through the significant rewrite of their athletics handbook, and so they've thought through this over the past year. And so this, as far as what consequences could be just for students caught possessing or being under the influence of drugs, not anything to do with any type of random student drug testing. And so they have some different verbiage in there, and so we would make sure that all lined up depending on which direction we want to go. But yes, we would get input from our sponsors as to what they thought was most appropriate.
And
I'm
go ahead.
sorry.
No, please go.
Well, real quick, I'm assuming the clock doesn't start over every school year on this. This is something this carries over year to year. If your freshman year, you get popped, you're on your second strike.
So
You're next.
that would be our understanding. Some of these have 180 days. Some of them are permanently dismissed from the program on that third result. When you get to the kind of the third or fourth consequence on there in some of these different policies, they're kind of all over the board as to what that district feels is appropriate. So it would be, in my reading of it, since 180 days or even longer, it would probably carry over.
My other question would be then, at that point, somewhere in there, I know there's education programs, is that something that we're looking at as well?
Yeah, you've got that in there as well. Education.
As far as
Education
education
slash-
programs or?
Well, just to try to help them, I cringe at the word rehab, but some program to help them.
We can certainly provide information for that. It's my understanding that since we were talking about funding on the first agenda item, that much of the funding for free counseling in the community has been taken away. And so even when I spoke with a school district close by about this, they used to require their students to go through some type of counseling before, as one of the consequences before they could return. But since those services are no longer available free in the community, they have since dropped that as a consequence or a requirement to come back.
Wow. I have a hard time swallowing that.
Any kind of
That's
free
why we have
online
phrased it
video
as
or something?
information to the family and the parents so far as not only the positive test result, but possibly those that they might be able to turn to, but I don't know that we'd be able to provide that.
And we don't have anything in the community that you know of at this time that
Not
could
at this
provide
time,
them.
no.
Is there any kind of online video or something? I mean, I don't know even if that would be effective, that they could watch. I mean, I know they have us do that periodically as board training.
Right.
But-
Not that I'm aware of.
You see how effective that is.
Right, here we are.
So I sense the desire, and we would certainly agree that this is not just about consequences. It's about helping kids get better and help kids getting reacclimated into that. I think what Mr. McIntyre was talking about a little bit is some of the dearth of mental health providers and resources that we have in the community, and that being kind of a stumbling block to some of the language that we've seen in other policies. So if it is the board's intent for us to look at ways that we can add an education component to it, some sort of component to help the student be able to resist drugs and move into be able to be reinstated, that's something that we can definitely be looking at. Don't know exactly what that might look like right now.
Well, perhaps the community can, maybe that's a place where they can weigh in. Maybe there is something that we're not aware of that they could weigh in on. And if they had that information, they certainly could contact the district about that as we're looking through this, because that would be helpful. I mean, I hate just saying, sometimes negative consequences provide some type of attention for kids, and that's some kind of attention. And I don't want it to just be an attention-getting way to keep getting even negative attention if we can help them in a positive way.
Yes, ma'am.
Did anyone else read the article by the American Pediatrics Association about this? Anyone do a Google search? And
I did not.
should have brought that. I should have brought my phone out here. So their recommendation is against random testing for various reasons. And one of them is, I think one of the reasons was there wasn't it's common that there isn't the counseling or the education following the positive result. And they encourage more proactive education versus consequences, versus random drug testing and consequences. I can send it all to you.
Do they provide any resources to accomplish that? And I mean, like, even if it would be something like staff training, I mean, the coaches and sponsors, part of their ongoing education, that could maybe be part of that. That's what I'm wondering, if they have that.
I will look
Obviously,
into
they're
that
not going to give
more.
us money.
Right. I will look into that more, and I'll send I can send everyone. Is that okay for me to send everyone that article? Send it to you? Okay.
Lastly, we've already touched on a few of these, but some of the decision points that I think would be good for us to think about between now and the next time we come together. What grade levels might, if we want to go this direction, what grade levels might be included? Typically, you see 7 through 12 or 9 through 12, to be quite honest with you. Are we interested in all three of those, as far as extracurricular activities, parking passes, and the opt-in option for parents and guardians? Orientation meetings, would those be mandatory for the student or both the student and the parent/guardian? Taking a look at the list of substances, we had some discussion here around the 9 panel, including alcohol, plus possibly K2. Are those the substances that we would say that we were interested in testing? The percent of students tested. We know that we have a pool. If we went 7 through 12 and all of these options, about 4,000 students who would be in that pool, what percent of students would we be interested in testing up to? Because not only are we talking about the percentage of students, but when you do the math on that, that can turn into quite a few tests. If we said 50%, that's 2,000 tests, and we have one school year, which is about 9 months. After open house and meet the teacher nights and those kinds of things, and towards the end of school, we have EOCs and finals and AP tests and those kinds of things. Where do we fit in that many tests? And so the percentage and just the logistics of being able to conduct that, I think, is something to consider as well. Retesting. would we want to require a negative test prior to returning for participation, whether it's parking or extracurricular activities? Would that be a requirement? Some districts do, some districts don't. And then, of course, the consequences, so far as the 30, 60, 90 days, there's lots of variations on that, as well as the appeal process, which typically would follow the appeal process that we have now, which is policy FNG.
Question on how if a student and the parents say, hey, I don't want my kid drug tested. So they get the automatic, what was the consequences of that?
If they are already in that extracurricular activity or parking pass, then that would automatically register as a positive test. And that would be made very clear, not only in the consent form, but also the orientation sessions and those kinds of things.
Does the $28, if we do the two tests together, does that include that I know someone has to be standing there somewhere near
It does include the testing company to be
present?
administering and
Okay.
present, yes.
In terms of the percentage, have they done any work to figure out what's an effective deterrent? I mean, or is it us guessing? I mean, I don't mean to-
What I have read, and I don't know if I read the specific article that you referred to, I've read a number of articles about whether it's an effective deterrent or not. And typically what I've read is concluded is that if you are relying solely on random student drug testing to solve issues or concerns that you have around drug use, it likely will not be successful. It depends on the school culture, which supports that. It depends on the school culture of being supportive of the student and not necessarily being punitive, but making sure that that information is there and that the consequences don't necessarily keep the student from, let's say, participating or staying in touch with that extracurricular activity in some way in student life, if you will. Because if you're counting on just that and saying, here's a consequence, we're going to do nothing else so far as meeting with mom and dad or guardians and the family around the education, counseling components, then typically it's not successful.
As far as your question, though, on percentage, is 50%, is 20%, is 10%? No, I don't know that there's any. I don't know if there's any definitive number out there, and I think the districts treat it in different ways. So I think what Greg was saying, we really have to think about is with a large number of kids subject to it, especially if we go 7 through 12 and all those activities. If we have a pretty high percentage, that would tax the staff. And number of kids coming down probably a number of times a year. So what is I think that's something we'll all have to wrestle with. What's a high enough percentage to get kids' attention and to really serve as a deterrent?
Yeah, and I think that deterrent effect is what we're really after. And if it takes a more comprehensive approach in addition to the testing, I think we need to look at that as well, because I don't think we're interested in just catching them and then punishing them. I mean, we actually are trying to do more than that. So that it sounds like it's a little bit bigger than just testing.
Yes, sir.
Well, and what effect would it have on our staff? The staff, like who's in charge of it as a staff? Who's making those phone calls? To me, I'm not against this by any stretch. Would love to see us have a deterrent, but I do think that we have to consider our staff that will have to probably be trained and educated, and will have to be willing to put in that extra time to. Right. On the surface, it's a great idea, but having to put it into effect, I think there's, as you all know, getting into it, that there's a lot more to it. There are a lot of pieces to this.
There absolutely is.
Anything else?
Comments?
Anyone? Yeah, great job. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, item C3, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to training for the board as the governing body of the Birth to 5 Head Start program. Dr. Ely.
Mr. Harris, members of the board, as you are all aware, we work with partnership with the Head Start Department to run the Birth to 5 Head Start program here in College Station ISD. As a federal program, annually it is under some portion of federal oversight and monitoring. One year it may be the educational services, one it may be healthcare services. Another year it may be governance, and I believe this year is a governance audit that that will be a part of our Head Start program. Mrs. Jackson is not able to be with us this evening, but Penny Trammell, Dr. Trammell, our Chief Academic Officer, is here to give us a little bit of training on some of the governance training that you'll need to have, and she'll take us through the handout that you have before you in regards to that. With that, Dr. Trammell.
Thank you. Essentially, there are 6 standards that you all as a governing body need to be trained on. And the first standard being completing an accurate application and ensuring that we have processes in place for that. We have assistance with the application process, especially if we think the family would qualify as McKinney-Vento, which is our homeless program. There's an individual interview process, and there's a checks and balances procedure in place for applications, and they're kept open until the application is absolutely complete. The second standard is along the lines of treating families with dignity and respect, and being attentive if we think there's any abuse going on, directing them to the proper services to help them. And we have all of those things in place. The interview occurs in an office, private, and not out in the public. And we have a list of community agencies to assist families that we feel might be in need based on the interview and the application. The third standard deals with false information and falsifying the application. So we train our staff. We train or work with the parents as they fill out the application. We have them sign a statement saying they have not falsified that application. We also in training our staff let them know that there could potentially be a consequence. They could be relieved of duty if they participate in that. The fourth standard deals with staff eligibility training. So if we have a staff member that is determining whether a child is eligible for the birth, to early Head Start program, they receive training. The law says they should receive it within 90 days. We ensure that they have it within 2 weeks, along with a specific checklist to make sure that they are holding true to the steps we have in place. The fifth standard deals with the time frame for the governing body. You are one of those governing bodies to receive training. You'll notice it says within 180 days of beginning a new term. We know we have Ms. Nolan is new, and we have to retrain you all every year, and so that is what we are doing right now. Yeah. Yes. And the last standard that we will address is just developing policies about how often you all will be provided training. And we have determined that that will be annually. And I would like to add that Ms. Nolan may request individual training should you feel you need additional information. And so if no one, well, no, I'm getting that. Yeah, right. So in essence, that is your training as the governing body to assure you we have procedures and processes in place for appropriate identification and service to the families that qualify for the program. Any questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any questions, anyone? No? Good. So, is that it? We're adjourned. Okay, we are adjourned.